Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those joining us out west. I'm Karen Kabolas with the National Emergency Management Association, and I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA webinar, Tracking Disaster Spending. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Bryan Koon, NEMA past president and currently Vice President of International Homeland Security and Emergency Management with IEM. Bryan, take it away.
Thanks, Karen, and welcome, everybody. We're happy to have you join us. Our speakers today are Colin Foard and Laura Adcock. Colin Foard is the Associate Manager with the Fiscal Federalism Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts, where he manages the team's work on natural disaster spending through stakeholder outreach and research design and implementation. Before joining Pew, Colin spent 5 years as a staff member for a senior member of the U.S. House Appropriations and Budget Committees, handling committee work and a broad policy portfolio, including Homeland Security, transportation, housing, and immigration issues. He also served as a congressional constituent caseworker and field representative in Oakland, California. Laura Adcock has been employed by the Ohio Emergency Management Agency, Ohio EMA, since 1992. She is currently the Disaster Recovery Branch Chief, where she oversees state and federal recovery programs focused on individual and public assistance. In addition, she provides training on damage assessment, the recovery process, cost documentation, and debris management, and assists local governments with debris management and recovery planning. Additionally, Ms. Adcock is responsible for the administration of the FEMA Public Assistance Grant Program following the presidential disaster declarations in Ohio, and has implemented the program for 27 presidential disaster declarations. Thank you both for being with us today. Colin, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks so much, Bryan. And let me start by thanking NEMA for putting today's session together and to all of you for joining us. As Bryan said, I'm Colin Foard, and I'm a researcher with the Pew Charitable Trusts. For those of you who aren't familiar with Pew, we're an independent, nonpartisan nonprofit that uses research to help policymakers develop and implement evidence-based policy. And my team, the Fiscal Federalism Initiative, looks at areas where federal policy changes affect state budgets. And that's a lens that we've been using to look at the issue of disaster spending. So what we've found broadly is that as disaster costs rise, the federal government is looking for ways to manage its costs and doing so in ways that could affect the states. And missing from that conversation is critical information about what states are currently doing. So today I'm going to be walking through some highlights from our report, What We Don't Know About State Spending on Natural Disasters Could Cost Us, which was based on our survey of state emergency management agencies. And then I'll hand it off to Laura to talk about how Ohio has taken action to address some of the issues that the report raises. Some of you may have heard me or my colleagues speak on this research in the past, so I'll try to keep it on the brief side, but it is some important context for the information that Laura is going to share. So with that, I'll jump right into it with the findings of our research, which are first and foremost that most states don't comprehensively track their disaster spending. And by that, we mean across all of the agencies involved and across all the phases of disaster. Second, from the information we were able to get from states, state spending on natural disasters varies widely, both in dollars and purpose, which has implications for how the federal proposals I mentioned would affect states. And that leads us to our overall recommendation, which is that federal and state policymakers commit to collecting more comprehensive data in order to inform their efforts to manage rising disaster costs, which is why we're here to speak with you today. Let's put some of those findings in perspective by answering some key questions. So first and foremost, why does state spending matter? Second, why is tracking state spending on disasters so challenging? And finally, what do the data that Pew collected tell us, and what are the policy implications of that information? So that first question, why does state spending matter? Three key reasons. So first, as you all are well aware, all levels of government, federal, state, and local, play a key role in major disasters. And the more severe disaster, the more likely all levels of government are going to be to get involved, and the more complex and interconnected the funding flows become. And since 2013, all 50 states have requested and received major disaster declarations at the federal level. I say that to show that this isn't just an issue for Texas or Florida or North Carolina, California. This is really a 50-state issue that we all need to be focused on. The second reason why state spending matters is that spending is on the rise. So FEMA's public assistance program, its largest program, had 8 of its most expensive years on record in the decade ending in 2016. And the U.S. Government Accountability Office is now estimating that the federal government has spent $450 billion on disasters since 2005. Which brings me to my third point, and I think this is a critical message for NEMA members, is that growing federal price tag is not going unnoticed in DC, which is why we've seen Congress, the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and the Government Accountability Office all taking hard looks at how to address rising federal costs and doing so in ways that could change the current federal-state relationship. So I won't delve too far into detail about those policy proposals. I'm happy to talk about them during the Q&A. But broadly, those would mean either changing the threshold at which states are eligible to receive federal funds, or providing incentives or requirements for states to spend their own money on disaster mitigation activities, which we all know can provide positive returns on investment when implemented. But here's the issue with all of these policy discussions is that they're missing key information about what states are actually doing. And that's because there's no central location or comprehensive place to find information about what states are spending. And that's really in large part because it's such a challenge to collect that information. And I can share some of the reasons why that's the case based on our research. And I'd invite you to think about what some of these challenges might be in your state. And I look forward to hearing Laura talk about how they overcame some of those challenges in Ohio. So as you can see, the first main challenge about looking at disaster spending is how it's spread across so many state agencies. So if we think about the federal level, we're all familiar with FEMA's role and HUD's role and the Department of Transportation's role, but there are in fact 17 major departments and agencies at the federal level involved in disaster assistance. And at the state level, it can be just as complex. So for example, Florida, one of the states we worked with, reported spending to us from as many as 11 different agencies. And as emergency managers, you know that it's not just the number of agencies involved, but it's also that those agencies may use different financial systems. They may code their expenditures for disasters differently, all making it a challenge to get a real comprehensive interagency picture of spending. The second challenge is that disasters are episodic, which means these types of expenses don't occur on a predictable or annual basis like other types of state spending. So your governor and state legislators aren't necessarily paying sustained attention year over year like they do for issues like Medicaid or K-12 education. So the bottom line is it can be challenging for states to track this data, but our research found that coordination can help, and we'll hear from Laura about how they leverage existing relationships and collaborative groups in Ohio to work on tracking their spending. So we know now why state spending is relevant and why tracking it can be challenging, but what about the data that Pew collected? So to back up a little bit, our report was based on a survey to NEMA members where we collected spending from states for a 5-year period from fiscal year 2012 to 2016 that included all agencies in all phases of disaster. We asked states for 2 types of spending. First, what they spend on their own programs for events that don't qualify for federal help. And second, the funds that states need to spend in order to receive certain types of federal aid, which you all will probably be familiar with as cost shares or matches. We heard back from 23 states as part of that effort with varying levels of specificity and completeness. And from the data we were able to collect and compare, we learned some interesting information. I'm going to share just some examples of that with you now. So first, we learned that states spend differently on their state level programs. So that can be in terms of the percentage they spend on state level programs. So example, in Delaware, 93% of the spending that they reported to us was for state level programs, whereas in Wyoming, 0% was for state level programs. It was all related to federal cost shares. States also spend differently on mitigation. So we found that Iowa, for example, had spent $49 million and North Dakota $226 million on flood control projects. And as I mentioned earlier, that's the type of spending that the federal government is potentially looking at trying to incentivize or require. And finally, we found that states split their federal cost shares and matches differently with local governments, with some states paying the entire cost share, some splitting it with a certain percentage, and some passing it entirely to local governments. And again, when we think about federal efforts to potentially shift the burden of costs onto states, that's going to mean something different for states where the state government is spending money on those cost shares versus states where the local governments are shouldering that cost. And that brings me to my conclusion, which is why all that variation matters. It's because there's a policy implication for the different ways that states spend on disasters. And that brings us to the recommendation of our report, is that it behooves both state and federal policymakers to have a more comprehensive understanding of how states spend and what they spend, because that's key information as the federal government is looking to manage rising costs across the country. We'll hear more from Laura about how states can operationalize this recommendation, but I'll leave you with just the concept that you can't manage what you don't track. So as disasters get more expensive and severe, these federal efforts aren't going to go away, and we need the best and most complete information possible in order to make sure that all of our efforts to manage these costs are as good as they can be. With that, I'll turn it over to Laura to share her information about Ohio.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, NEMA and Colin, for your support in our efforts that we've been working on over the last several years. So I'll just go ahead and go right into my first slide. This presentation was originally created for the association. It was for budget folks. So we had a brief discussion during that presentation on the basics of emergency management, in case they weren't familiar with it. But since we're all familiar with emergency management here with NEMA and our partners, I'm not going to belabor that first slide other than to say that, you know, recovery and disaster spending is a local, state, and federal issue or concern, and it's important for us to be able to leverage whatever information we can get from the local and state level to ensure that we are properly messaging our needs with the federal government when we're making disaster requests for assistance. So our challenges with how we used to do it is that we didn't have a method for how we used to do it. We had discussed utilizing the functions of WebEOC and creating boards in WebEOC to possibly manage and track expenses that we had related to activations, but we didn't move very far in that avenue. But it's important to make sure that you're tracking what you're spending so that you can get proper reimbursement from insurance, from the federal government, so that you can properly message to policymakers and leaders what we're actually spending on disasters, what we're spending when we're activating the Emergency Operations Center. We want to make sure that we can quantify what the impact is to the state's budget. Part of that, you know, came around when we were discussing the PA deductible concept and the challenge in trying to demonstrate to FEMA how we could meet that deductible and what our spending was as a state and local government, and having a system to readily answer those questions should that deductible concept have come to fruition. And then, of course, we want to make sure that we can support those requests for federal assistance or direct federal assistance to show that we have, in fact, exhausted our resources and require assistance from the federal government. So we need all of that information in order to paint the best picture regarding that disaster and the response and recovery that's required from it. So the challenge the greatest challenge initially that we had with our new process is if there was a way within our state accounting system that we could code the disaster spending, so that we could say, okay, we've had a disaster, we've activated the Emergency Operations Center, state agencies and your fiscal offices, this is the code that we're going to use for this disaster, so that we could then, essentially run reports out of our state accounting system to capture that disaster spending at a very broad level. Well, we determined that our state accounting system was limited in the number of fields that were available to each agency, and the fields that were there couldn't properly capture payroll. So we couldn't go on that broad stroke of one coding. So when we wrote the policy and when we pushed the information out to the fiscal offices, we make them aware that you are going to need to come up with your own internal tracking within the state accounting system in order to run reports for your specific agency. So we weren't able to get that broad picture of what the disaster was spending across the state. All right, so this is just a little bit about the process. So the first item there, finding motivation. There were several things that went into us at Ohio EMA and the state looking at what we're spending for disasters. So of course it started with the concept of the PA deductible, the public assistance deductible, and again leveraging what we were spending in order to meet a deductible if it was put in place. And then of course our wonderful partnership with the Pew and the work that we did to address that survey that was published also got us thinking about and coordinating with our other state partners on how we could capture and identify what we were spending on federal highway grants or what we were spending at other state agencies on emergency grant programs that they have that are entirely state funded. We were also at the same time updating our annex to our emergency operations plan that was for the financial accounting, the financial management. And then, of course, there were some articles that came out following the 2017 hurricanes about properly tracking and providing transparency to the media and to the residents of the states and the taxpayers what was actually being spent on disasters at the state level. So all of those things kind of came together at once, and we were able to get leverage and have a really, really good discussion with our Office of Budget and Management. I think if we would not have had that relationship and that buy-in from that agency, it would have been difficult for us to actually implement a policy. But we had that. Our partners that we worked with from Ohio EMA, we had the recovery branch, our EOC manager, our fiscal branch, and our plans branch. So we had a large group of people from Ohio EMA that participated in those discussions with OBM and worked out all the details of the policy that we would put into place. We drafted a policy and we implemented it as a pilot in 2018 when we had a partial activation of the Emergency Operations Center. That policy is available. We can provide that to NEMA and they can share that with the attendees if you'd like to see that. But essentially what we do is if we go to partial activation of the Emergency Operations Center, partial activation in our definition is that we've asked all or some state partners, non-governmental organizations, to actually come to the Emergency Operations Center to address the mission assignments and the response to the disaster. So at partial activation, this policy would go out. It is signed by Sim Merrick, Director of Ohio EMA, and it goes out to all the CFOs, the Chief Financial Officers of the state agencies and the commissions in the state of Ohio. And this policy outlines these are what we want you to track. This is how frequently we want you to report this to our fiscal office, Ohio EMA's fiscal office, how often we want them to report. And then what we would do as our fiscal office is we would gather all of that information for the spending going on across the state to have that ready and available for anyone that would want to have that information. Our Web EOC manager and our EOC manager and our OBM, one of our OBM partners, gave a presentation to the chief financial officers across the state to bring this policy to them. And it's also, we're currently creating job aids on how to best implement the policy. We implemented it again in 2019, this past May, when we had our tornado outbreak that hit the Dayton, Ohio area. and we are still continuing to gather information on disaster spending from our state partners. We still have one mission assignment open that we're working, so we're still working on gathering that information from our partners on that spending. So I kind of jumped into this information here, but again, we established that policy. It's in place. It's been in place since July 1 of 2018. Cons to the solution is time lag in getting the information. So since we couldn't put something into place in our state accounting system that we could broadly go in and look at, we have to rely on these chief financial officers to get the information that we need and get it to our fiscal office. And then of course it's very labor intensive to have all of that work done using Excel spreadsheets or whatnot rather than being able to print it out of a state accounting system. So what we've asked them to capture are their personnel costs, whether that's working in the Emergency Operations Center or working in their own offices to address mission assignments or what have you, whatever they're doing in relation to the disaster. Any equipment that they purchased as a result of the response, their resource usage and depreciation, expendable items used due to the disaster, so purchasing ice, water, tarps, generators, whatever it might be. State-owned infrastructure damage, which in a part it's easier because if you've got building damage, then we have our Department of Administrative Services oversees the policy for the state of Ohio, but they still have to rely on, you know, the district offices and stuff that aren't in Columbus to get them the information that they've had damages at their facilities. But it would also be ODOT, their roads that they own, our parks that are owned by the Department of Natural Resources, things like that. And then the last piece of it is that we've asked them to share with us any grant or loan assistance that they're providing to local governments or disaster survivors outside of the FEMA suite of programs, because we can capture that data should we get a federal disaster declaration. We have a state IA program and a state PA program here at Ohio EMA that we can track. And again, I mentioned earlier, we've got a couple of state agencies that have loan programs and grant programs to help local governments with repairs to infrastructure that we can collaborate with and get information from. And just as a side note, it's good. Another reason it's good to have that partnership and have that visibility on the spending that's going on, the grants and loans going to the local governments, because it allows us as a state to better leverage our resources and know best where to put our spending so that we're not duplicating efforts. All right, again, I did kind of jump ahead to this, but the Ohio EMA sends the memorandum to the CFOs, and those CFOs are to return their costs to us. So for the next steps, my conclusion here, we are still working on keeping an update of the State Emergency Operations Plan, making sure that we're improving that annex to the plan. And we're also working on improving how best to track that data. And maybe an end result will be that we have a mechanism within WebEOC to have boards in there where state agencies can go in and track it right into there, and we can maybe push reports out of WebEOC rather than our fiscal office having to do all of that work. So that's all I have. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Laura. We're going to move on now into the Q&A portion of the webinar. I'm going to start off with a couple, though, of my own. Laura, as you've embarked upon this effort, how do you analyze it? Have you had a chance to analyze it to any great detail? And has it highlighted any surprises, imbalances, areas of improvement, or areas of best practice so far on what you've learned?
So the activations that we had where we actually implemented the policy had some state engagement, but it wasn't a large group of people, and or a large group of agencies, and we didn't have significant missions that we were tracking. I'd say that the fact that we could get a policy put in place as quickly as we did in a 6-month time frame is definitely a success. I think a challenge will continue to be to encourage the chief financial officers to to submit information to us so that we have that level of knowledge of what the disaster spending is when we do those activations.
And just as a follow-up, you mentioned that you had a process in place. How replicatable do you think that would be for other states to use? How much, in other words, how much would they have to change it in order to use? Or do you think they could take it and use it pretty much as it is right now?
They could take it and use it the way it is now. The policy doesn't get into, accounting specifics. It just gives them the direction of, we have a spreadsheet that we send to them that they can populate. And again, it's not anything that couldn't be easily tweaked and utilized by other partners.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Laura. Colin, next one is for you. And you highlighted during your presentation the 17 agencies at the federal level that spend money on disasters. And for those of you listening to the webinar, the GAO did a study on that several years ago. And it's excellent reading, one, to kind of, again, see where the federal dollars are, but two, as an emergency management professional at the state or local level, it can provide insight into where other funding streams can come from for whatever situation you're dealing with. But of course, that study captures funding in all different phases of disasters. So Ohio, I think, has a terrific start on this and capturing, but it sounds primarily like it's mostly response and into the recovery funding, whereas the ones that GAO did also covered a lot of the preparedness and mitigation work as well. And ultimately, in order to be able to compare apples to apples on this, states are going to have to capture that information as well. So Colin, when you did the analysis across the country, and 23 states responded, did you see a difference in their ability to capture across the 4 different phases of emergency management, and 5 if you count prevention? Or were they better at doing response and lesser the other ones? Or did you have any insight into how they were across the phases?
That's a great question. I think we definitely saw variation in the types of spending that states were most readily able to share with us. I would say the easiest thing for states to provide us was spending related to FEMA programs, since that's information that needs to be tracked, as Laura was mentioning, in order to recoup federal funds. So that, in that case, that would be recovery funding. I think mitigation spending as it related to federal funds, again, was something that states had at hand. But I think it was a challenge for folks to define, in some cases, what was mitigation spending. We provided them with our definition, but some programs that are initiated in state environmental offices or related to wildfire mitigation might not have been as top of mind for people when they were looking to report the spending. But I appreciate the point that you're making, which is one that we've been trying to make, is that the spending tracking should be comprehensive across phases of disaster, because what that really tends to reveal is how large a proportion of spending is going towards the response and early recovery phases, as opposed to mitigation. It's unfortunately tough to put a number to that now, because at both the federal and state level, the data is limited. I would just add one more thing, which is that at the federal level, there has been a recognition of that issue. And we've seen recently several efforts to improve tracking across phases. So one is that FEMA has initiated a spending explorer for the federal spending across agencies that's happening after the 2017 and 2018 disasters. And the U.S. House passed just a few weeks ago a bill requiring federal agencies to report their spending to Congress and OMB every year on disasters. And one of the points they make in that legislation is that it could help direct more resources towards cost-saving mitigation in the long term if we had a better sense of that spending.
Excellent. Thank you, Colin. As an aside, I think anybody who's ever had a conversation with me or seen me give a speech in a time in the last 6 years or so has probably heard me discuss the high probability that at some point FEMA will change the threshold and change the requirements for states to invest in their own disaster management processes. And so, what I've urged, I've been pushing this for a long time, is it's right now not a level playing field in terms of negotiating. The states just simply don't have the data necessary to counter what the feds are able to clearly show as their investment in that area. So having an understanding of the data that they should be collecting so that when those conversations do occur, that they are fair across the board, I think is vital. Colin, one of the things that it's even more difficult to capture this kind of spending at the local level, and primarily just because there are so many local governments at counties and city and villages, et cetera. Have you given any consideration to how you could accomplish this same type of study at a level of government below that of the state?
Sure, that's definitely something that came up as a question frequently when we were developing the research, in part because, as I said, really all levels of government are involved in this disaster assistance system. One way we tried to capture a little bit of information about that was to include questions about how states split their cost share with local governments, and that's something that I know NEMA asks folks about too for their biennial report. But certainly it's just as important for local governments to have a sense of their spending on disasters, especially those smaller disasters, as it is for states. We have had some discussion with NACO, the National Association of Counties, about our research and about what could be translated to the local level. And I know some academics have been looking at how you translate this to the local level, but it's certainly, just as strong a message at the local level as it is at the states. I think the advantage at the state level is that, as you said, there are 50, so instead of several tens of thousands. So it is a more manageable thing to get done than it would be to do it at the local level.
Okay. So Colin, I'm going to continue on, I think, and Laura, feel free to jump in on this as well. So I think, one of the positive things that we're seeing is that as jurisdictions across the country are investing in their infrastructure and building or rebuilding roads, drainage systems, pumps, what have you, they are engineering them for disasters of the future and climate of the future. And that's terrific and that's fantastic. You could make an argument that, doing that type of development that is designed for the future and not necessarily what they're going to encounter today is really a form of mitigation and should be captured as such. Colin and or Laura, have you given any thought as to how would you break that up? So let me just give you for instance here. Say you wanted to build a mile of road, and today I happen to be sitting in Louisiana. Say you wanted to build a mile of road in Louisiana, and it was going to cost you $1 million, but you were planning for, say, sea level rise, and you wanted to elevate that road by a foot, and now it's going to cost you $1.2 million. Any thoughts as to how, as we go forward on this and start really slicing and dicing this, how do we differentiate between the baseline that jurisdictions would be spending on these kind of projects and what is above and beyond and should really go into that mitigation category? And I know I'm diving kind of into the weeds on this piece of it, but I think it is a cost that could be worth capturing.
I guess getting in the weeds too and sticking with the basics, you could approach it the same way that FEMA approaches it when they fund Forest 6 mitigation. That they could delineate out, here's the repairs, and then here's what we're doing extra to mitigate and make that facility more resistant. We've also been considering here in Ohio for the last several years, having a state mitigation program where we would have mitigation dollars, state funded, that could go out to the communities to help make their communities more resilient. But I think there does need to be a focus on the infrastructure and making that infrastructure more resilient, just because it's so old and everything. Obviously, it doesn't take a whole lot to damage a road that or culvert that hasn't been replaced in 30 years. So I guess if I was gonna, I would try to make it simple, and I would just approach it in a way that we're all used to, and delineate between putting it back the way it was before it broke, and then we know what we can do to make it more resilient. I don't know if that answers your question, Brian, but
no, that does. That's yeah.
And this is Colin. I would add that, from my perspective, that $1 million is a fixed amount of money that a state has. States have balanced budgets, and for a state, that's a lot of money. So why not spend it in a way that we know from research could have a positive return on investment? So we're all pretty familiar with the National Institute of Building Sciences figure that for every dollar spent in mitigation, you can save $6 in post-disaster recovery costs. Perhaps after this, NEMA could send around the analysis that we did recently based on NIBS data that showed that return on investment varies by state and across types of disaster, but in every case you get a positive return on those grants if you look across the study period that they worked on. So but that would be my response, is that better tracking can lead to a better sense of the money that states have available and a better ability to make forward-thinking and strategic decisions about what to do with those same resources.
Excellent. Thank you both. Okay, so I've got a few other questions here, and Laura, this one's coming to you from Summer Erickson. How did you decide to track at partial activation versus full activation versus enhanced operations?
well, we'll track at all levels. The partial activation is the first time we would start tracking. So we didn't want to say we'll implement the policy at full activation, because partial activation could still have costs being incurred by state agencies in relation to the disaster. So that's just our starting point. We would certainly have that policy in place if we were at full activation as well.
Okay, excellent, thanks. Okay, so Brett Cox has a question. It takes a little bit of time, so I'm gonna read it all. Does Ohio's tracking enable them to distinguish between the following purposes? 1, all costs incurred, including the regular time payroll, budget expenses, payments only made because of disasters, and 3, eligibility for FEMA PA inclusion.
So it was payroll. What was the second thing? Payroll.
Budget expenses, payments only made because of disaster, and then eligible for the PA inclusion.
Right. So the costing, the payroll and the budgeting, it's going to depend on how those individual state agencies code it, how well they're going to be able to track it against a budget. So we would be able to do it at Ohio EMA because we already do disaster spending tracking anyways, but our fiscal office could certainly assist other fiscal officers and other state agencies that don't normally do this, and how best to code so that you can capture your regular time, your overtime. It can happen because we do it here at EMA. As far as the eligibility against public assistance, that's probably where once they're submitting those spreadsheets to us, to our fiscal office, that they would have to bring that information to me, and I would have to sit down and look at that spending against the public assistance eligibility to see what would be eligible or what wouldn't be eligible for reimbursement.
Okay, thanks, Laura. Okay, so the next question is from my friend Sam Phillips, the Massachusetts EM director. She says, Ohio's work seems to be focused on state costs only. Do they see a rollout of this program to local municipalities as well?
It's very difficult. As we've already talked about, there are so many local governments in all of our states. Outside of requiring local governments to do damage assessment after every single event, I don't know how we would be able to effectively implement that. So I have EM Grants, the MB3 software system, and it has a damage assessment component to it. And if we were able to we could get essentially all of our local governments into that grants management system with points of contact, and ask that they submit damage assessment information or damages whenever they have any kind of localized impact or something that wouldn't reach our level for funding, our thresholds for our state program or the FEMA thresholds.
Yeah.
So we have the mechanism in place to do it, but I don't know how we could enforce it to make it effective.
Yeah, it seems to me that's similar to conversations that Laura, you and I and many others had when the rollout of the PA deductible idea came out in 2016, which is we can capture the costs for the larger ones where the state activates, but it's the day-to-day issues, what counts and what doesn't. As you work towards that threshold, as you work towards that deductible, what do you count? How far up, how big does it have to be to count towards it? And you're right, it is a challenge. All right, Summer is prolific in her questions, and so thank you. She's got two more. I'm going to ask them both at the same time. This one, again, I think it's to you, Laura. Do you still require each agency to fund their portion of the emergency costs, or is there statewide funding that is triggered at some point? And another one, Laura, do you set incident budgets across all state agencies?
So for the second one, to my knowledge, no, we do not set incident budgets. We go to our state controlling board on a quarterly basis and request some money from the Emergency Purposes Fund, which is an OBM held fund that we draw like a quarterly budget from them for if we have to activate the EOC. So we do that, but I'm not aware of any other state agency that does that. And yes, we require the state agencies to meet their match how they see fit, but they also have access to that Emergency Purposes Fund. So technically they could go to the same fund that we go to address our either unreimbursed expenses or our cost share.
Okay.
And Bryan, I would just jump in there too, that this raises a point that we bring up somewhat in the report, which is that in a lot of cases, in order to implement spending tracking, you need high-level attention in your state, and the governor's budget office can be a really good partner in that. And I think Laura could speak to that in terms of how Ohio EMA partnered with their budget office. But that is really a part of state government that has purview over and an understanding of agencies across state government and how they're funded. And I'd be remiss if I didn't plug some ongoing research that we're doing about how states budget for disasters, which gets a bit to the previous question about where the funding for these agencies comes from. So we're looking at the different mechanisms states have available to pay for the variety of costs that come up along the life cycle of a disaster.
Okay, thank you both. So I'm going to pause for 1 second. Have you, and Laura, this is still fairly new. It seems to me that the system you're doing will shine a light on state agency costs. I could envision a scenario where at some point one state agency feels like they're taking on too great a share of the burden for whatever the disaster is, and cause some issues with it. So that may be a possible repercussion. I'm just guessing. Have you seen that yet, or has that not occurred?
No, that has not occurred to my knowledge.
Okay, Brett Cox, I think if you're listening there, you've asked some really good questions here. I think I'm going to offer you the opportunity to just ask your question rather than me read it to you, since you have some really good ones.
Okay, so it sounds like when you're talking about you're pulling these reports based on coding in your accounting system, and maybe I'm misunderstanding, but to me that sounds like that's great to be able to pull disaster costs after those payments have been made or entered into the accounting system. Does your process enable you to collect estimates along the way so that you can keep your governor's office or whatever informed on what costs may have been incurred, but even if the payments haven't come through, or the invoices haven't come in yet for the accounting system?
All right, so I'm not a fiscal person, so hopefully I'm accurate in what I'm about to say, but any purchase that we make, whether it's a future purchase or it's, it doesn't make sense, like it's something that we are going to purchase that won't be here for 2 weeks or something like that, we have to do a purchase order. So that purchase order can get that coding that we've created for that incident. So we can be tracking it even though we don't have the final invoice yet. So we can track it right from when we know we're going to incur that expense. And then we have a state credit card that we can utilize for emergency purchases that would require us to go back after the fact and put that coding to it. But we could track that internally as an agency and make sure that it gets tied to the disaster.
Okay, that makes sense.
And hopefully my fiscal office isn't listening to this and aren't going to run over here and say, oh, no, you're saying all the wrong things. But
Thank you, Brett, for that question. I appreciate it. Okay, so Colin, one of the things that I think Ohio did really well was find a champion or champions to help push this. And I think that's probably something that many states would need. Emergency managers, although they carry a lot of clout, they may not carry a lot of clout at the times necessary to do this, which would be during blue skies. And so getting, the governor's office, the management office, the budget office, the other state agencies interested in this can sometimes require perhaps a bit more heft or different heft than what the EM folks are able to do. So when you looked across the country, did you identify a group or a job description or organization or a function that expressed a great deal of interest and excitement about that others could use as the touch point to try to initiate this own kind of data collection in their state?
I would say when we were rolling this out to NEMA members, we did have a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of great help from not only state directors, but some amazing fiscal folks in the emergency management agency. So certainly I would reiterate that there's a important role for EMs in these efforts. I would say that, as I mentioned before, these budget offices and governor's offices do have the type of cross-state purview needed to collect information in some cases and to compel information in other cases, which is sometimes the case. Other stakeholders that could take interest in this are state legislators. So we have partnered with the National Conference of State Legislatures to provide some education on this issue, because as you can imagine, as I mentioned, state legislatures aren't confronted with disaster issues on a regular basis unless something affects their district, in which case they often become advocates and have to learn about this stuff overnight. So we do see a lot of groups out there and folks out there who could help promote tracking efforts, but to identify something specific, I'm not too sure.
Okay, well, thank you. One of the things that just popped into my mind, and this is a freebie for any of you mitigation folks out there, is one of the challenges you often see is states and locals coming up with that 25% cost share for mitigation projects. But perhaps if states were able to demonstrate a significant and compelling investment, of 100% in mitigation projects outside of those, as I stated before, and just some examples of elevating roadways or drainage systems, et cetera, you might be able to work. We could design systems where that cost share was spread across multiple projects and not necessarily just for the individual one that FEMA was financing. So again, I think there's lots of opportunities once you have a comprehensive data set. It really opens the doors, I think, for some more creative negotiations with FEMA and other federal funding sources down the road. All right, so Karen, I do not see any more questions nor anybody raising their hand eager to ask one. So at this point, I'm going to thank everybody for their participation today and pass it back to you.
Thank you so much, Bryan. Wow, that was a great Really great discussion. Thank you to the excellent audience for your participation, your great questions. Thank you very much to Bryan for your moderating expertise, and Colin and Laura for sharing with us today. It was really fantastic. If you're interested in learning more about NEMA, please visit our website, www.nemaweb.org. Thank you again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.